Hello, welcome to A Lesson Before Writing, episode 30. I'm Ted Morrissey. I'm here with my co hosts, Brady Harrison. This is Brady's most recent book that we've published, A Journey to Al Ramel, available in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle editions. And Brady's hard at work on a new collection, which we may touch on very easily. And you're also with Grant Tracy, and this is Grant's most recent Hayden Fuller novel, A Shoeshine Kill, book number 4 of the Hayden series. And the paperback edition also has 4 Eddie Sands short stories in there. And I will just mention that we are days away from my first poetry collection, Aspiring Child, a biography of Mary W. Shelley in sonnets, will be released on January 1st, the same day that Frankenstein was officially released in 1818, and that was not a coincidence. It's been on pre-sale. What's that?
It's like a trilogy, right? You got like 3 Shelley.
Yeah, I've got 3 books that were inspired by Mary Shelley. An Untimely Frost, which came out in 2014, and it's again inspired by Mary Shelley, but it's about the rumor, a little better than rumor, that Washington Irving, when he was in London, he and Mary Shelley entertained the idea of an amorous relationship. It never quite worked out, but I thought as a novelist, I would like that to have worked out, so I pursued that. And then Mrs. Saville, which I think the British actually say Savile, is my 2018 sequel to Frankenstein. And so, so this is the 3rd Mary Shelley book that I've done, and I really enjoyed the heck out of writing these sonnets. So we'll see what happens with that. So we've got plenty of stuff to talk about, like always, and of course our faithful viewers know that at the end of the podcast, last 30 minutes or so, we will talk about a short story in the Shanghai Literary Review. We've never done a story from this journal, or for that matter, a story from a journal originating in Asia. So that will be new to this episode as well. So we are have all kinds of things going on. I don't think we've ever recorded this close to Christmas before. We've done other December issues, but I think we usually have knocked them out earlier in the month. So this is a little later in the month. So we got a lot of stuff going on, but we don't usually get a lot of people asking questions and commenting on previous podcasts. But but last episode we talked a lot about first-person narration versus third-person narration, and I actually got quite a bit of feedback on that, and several people found that very useful and very interesting. Now, I did have one question posed to me wanting further clarification from something Grant said. Grant, you talked about heat versus cold, and sort of put that within the paradigm of first person versus third person narration. Do you remember that comment? Can you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of what you were talking about?
Yeah, I think I stole the idea from the Romantic poets. It's been so long since, I love the Romantic poets, don't get me wrong. But I think it was Wordsworth that had that famous line, recollected in tranquility. And that's for him what meter did. Like, it takes the hot passion of them, because you're supposed to get into like a childlike state, and just like a kid when they see blades of grass for the first time, what is this marvelous thing? And us old folks, it's like, what the fuck's this? Like, we get bored, jaded, we lose our idealism, and so there's that hot response to things that we have as a kid. And when you write in first person, it can be very hot. And I think you have to be a little careful that as a writer, that the voice doesn't get away from you. You start showing off, hey, look what I can do. Hey, lady, kind of like you go Jerry Lewis. And that, for me, that was a danger early in my career. And I found third person, I could walk close along, that central intelligence thing of Henry James, and walk close alongside the character, very close to the sensibilities of the character. But just having that one remove, gave me more control of kind of like the way Hemingway uses, that kind of iceberg prose to create some distance from some pretty violent moments in his work. And so that's where I got that idea from. So I think maybe that's what I was. I hope that elaborates it for people out there. I've got more confident writing first person, and I feel I don't need to hide. I shouldn't say hide, but maybe that's what I did when I was younger. Hide behind limited third because I was afraid of not having, my characters being Promethean and eating up all the scenery and the fire and everything else. So that
Hmm.
that's my cautionary tale, I guess. But as I've progressed as a writer, I mean, all the Hayden Fuller stuff are in first person, and I don't necessarily feel it. The language or the sensibilities are overwrought or getting away from me. But my younger self certainly felt that way when I tried first person.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Well, so Brady, you're welcome to comment on that. But another thing I wanted to ask you in particular, we've been talking about the fact that you're writing this collection of short stories, which are all kind of in response or in conversation with different Ernest Hemingway stories. And a couple of them have been published here and there, which is very cool. But then I got to thinking, obviously the Hemingway short story canon is enormous. How are you deciding that you want to maybe respond to this Hemingway versus, that one and not the 70 other Hemingway short stories? What do you have a particular kind of modus operandi, or you just kind of use a magic 8 ball, or what's going on?
Oh, okay. Well, so that's actually some really complicated mathematics. Uh, so not some of the stories are in direct conversation with uh, Hemingway stories, like Hills Like White Elephants and A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, the couple published stories that you mentioned. Those are very much in response, direct response to the Hemingway stories. And there's a number, several of the pieces are in conversation with The Sun Also Rises, but a number of the stories are in conversation with episodes from Hemingway's life, or in response to the kind of ethos, the macho ethos in particular, that Hemingway put forward. And so, working now on a hunting story, but it's a comedy. It's a comedy of
Mm,
errors, and so it's not in response to any one particular work of Hemingway's, but it's in response to the hunting and the fishing stories. Uh, the other thing I need to say, and so we need to check this with all of the staff of lawyers on retainer 12 Winters. Uh, the stories are only in response to those that are in the public domain, so that there's no hijacking of copyright.
right.
So I want to be
Well,
very careful about that. Like, I don't want, if Ted should happen to have to go to jail and stuff, then I would feel badly.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah.
this and this comes back to that. I think I talked about this during our the podcast in Cedar Falls. And maybe I didn't, but the palimpsest, that idea that there is no original text because there's been so much created that, like James Bond, there's so many iterations. So what's the original Bond now? We get, and Nosferatu. I just rewatched that movie for like the third time, and it's astounding, and how it deals with both the Murnau text, which is a plagiarized variation on Dracula on the Stoker text, but then it's also doing its own thing, bringing in Roma culture and other aspects and dealing with notions of hysteria, the female body, all of that. It's a palimpsest, and that sounds like what you're doing is, in part, Brady, is it's not just Hemingway; it's Hemingway the star image, Hemingway
Oh, yeah.
the meta world, all of the social discourse and constructions around Hemingway that allows you to, kind of invest in really fascinating ways with this figure. So I think that's awesome.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, the legend of Hemingway is so immense, and its place in the stratosphere of American writing. Yeah, so there's a lot to work with and encounter. And uh, part of, and I'll stop nattering on and pass this back to Ted, but the family dynamics and the family history of the Hemingways, like they were trouble's not the right word. There was complexities in their lives, and so some of what I'm interested in investigating is some of that complexity. But it's nerve-wracking for the same reason some of the sections of A Journey to Al Ramal, some of the characters who appear, because I'm always troubled by the ethics of writing about people who actually existed. So
Yeah.
yeah, so we'll see.
Well, um, when I wrote that novel that was inspired by the Shelley, Washington Irving, potential for a romantic relationship kind of thing, I didn't write about Mary Shelley per se and Washington Irving per se. I made up new names that were like their names, and I sort of drew from their biographies and their bibliographies, loosely, but made up my own stuff as well. And part of the reason that I wanted to give myself that luxury was because I had spent about 3 years writing a fictionalized biography of Herman Melville and his experience on the Marquesas Islands when he lived among cannibals for several months when he was a young sailor and jumped ship. And of course, he wrote his novel Typee, which is a highly autobiographical account of that experience. So I was sort of retelling, revising Typee, but also Melville's biography. And I was very conscious of trying to be true to Melville's biography. But the thing is, even something as exciting as that, jumping ship and being, taken in by cannibals and not being sure if you're going to end up, when they take you to dinner, are you going to be the dinner? You're just not sure. As exciting as that is, it doesn't necessarily have a natural, satisfying narrative arc like fiction tends to. And so I was always kind of battling with, the staying true to what really happened as much as we can say versus what the needs of the narrative might be. And again, I felt a little bit boxed in by that. I think when we watch like biopics, when we watch movies, for example, that are based on real people and real events, oftentimes the ending kind of falls flat because life doesn't often provide a very narratively satisfying ending or whatever. So, so I think you're wise, Brady, to kind of pick and choose and use things as you find them, but be willing to sort of invent as you go as well. Have you run into that though with this, even that you have felt sometimes boxed in by Hemingway's actual life experiences, or are you not too worried about that?
Oh, yeah, isn't that interesting? Yes and no. Because of the experience of A Journey to Al Ramal, where I invented pretty wildly to suit my bigger purposes, I kind of feel that latitude here as well. Nonetheless, I want to be honorable. The purpose of this is not to belittle or to attack or treat ironically or to satirize or even parody Hemingway. Like at a certain point in my life, he was a writer that mattered a great deal to me. And I want to take the work seriously, even as, yes, I want to work against that kind of constraint.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's not a biography. And I like the idea of conversation pieces. I know we've talked about this, or I certainly talk about this a lot, but that tradition of writers writing back and forth and kind of taking the piss with one another. I like that very well, but respectfully.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, just as a point of fact, though, and this 12 Winters Legal just wanted me to remind you, it gets tricky because, Hemingway is just barely into the public domain, but not all of his stuff is. And for
Nope.
example, things of his that were published in Europe, maybe in translation or something, they may still be under copyright.
Yep.
So when you're this close to the bone, sometimes you can run into some of those kinds of issues. I'm sure we're fine, but that's why so oftentimes people will delve back into Shakespeare, and beyond, because obviously there's no sense of even being close to copyright and that kind of thing. But yeah, that can get tricky. I'm always encouraging my students to consider revisionist work, but I always double underline the fact that if you're going to do this for publication, as opposed to just sort of an exercise or something, maybe for a class or something, that you always want to be cognizant of that copyright and how that's going to work. Grant, you did a whole series of James Cagney stories. I think once upon a time you and I talked about maybe doing just a collection of Cagney stories. Then you kind of turned to crime noir as your
Yeah.
main focus. But I don't know. Do you want to speak to that? The
Yeah.
taking
I
liberties with a real person who had
well,
a real life story.
I really kind of dig what Brady's saying. And I think we give a lot more grace to because all this what do you call it, multiverse stuff, right? I mean, Batman in the multiverse, and we can have all kinds of Batman stories, and we can have Gwen Stacy survive and become, Spider Girl or Spider Woman, Spider Gwen, whatever, so I mean, with Cagney, and I like the word respectful that Brady said. I always wanted to respect the individual, and I would make some assumptions, like but just reading between the lines. Like I think he battled depression at times, and it's not really clearly stated, but it's clear that he had bouts of melancholia, and so I worked some of that into the stories. But he was a very honest person. He didn't smoke or drink. He told it like it was. And so I brought that to the character, and then I put him in situations that um, were half concocted. Like, for example, one of my short stories, Cagney and his father went to Ossining, and they played a baseball game against the prisoners there. And it's wrote about, I think, in Richard Schickel's biography on Cagney. And I thought, what a great idea for a story. And then I took that and I blended it with a personal thing. My dad and I did a very similar thing. We played a softball game with a bunch of prisoners, I think in Kingston. And my dad was freaked out by all the fencing and stuff. He felt locked in. I thought that was like the coolest experience ever. We lost the game, but I used a lot of the details about my father's and my relationship, mapped it onto Cagney, but I felt I was true to it because Cagney's dad was an alcoholic like my father. And I was able to make connections. So the story surprised me. It went places I didn't expect it to go, but I felt like I was doing it in the spirit of Cagney, if that makes sense. That I was true. I guess it sounds so stupid, but true to what I see as part of his essence, if there is such a thing as essence. Again, I don't want to get too philosophical, but so that was my goal, was to be respectful, but to be imaginative and not to worry about the historical record, but to play with it and go new, fresh places with it. So yeah, and the story ends with a fight scene, and there's all kinds of other things that go on. It's in the final stanzas, and that story is very personal to me, but it's also very Cagney-esque. So probably one of the most quasi autobiographical stories I ever wrote.
Huh. Yeah, I was going to mention that it's part of the Final Stanzas, which was our 12 Winters first book of yours that we published, a collection of literary stories, which also there's a really cool audiobook version of Final Stanzas. So check that out if
And
you're
Jeremy
into.
Schraffenberger read that story because he's a baseball fan. So I asked him to be the reader for that. So my good friend
Oh, okay.
Jeremy
Okay. That's
does
right.
the,
That's
does the
right.
vocals on that. So he did a great
Yeah.
job.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. Hey, I think post holidays, we're going to do a bonus episode where we talk and bring Jeremy on into the mix and talk about Short Story Literary Magazine, which
Oh, cool.
you, Grant, and Jeremy are resurrecting. And Brady and I have had the honor of being asked to be on the advisory board. And so I don't know, we want to spend a lot of time in this episode because you just maybe give us kind of a quick overview of what that project is about and mention
Yeah.
the story contest while you're at it.
Yeah, sure. We the first few issues are going to be generated by contest only, and what I'm hoping is that we can generate enough interest, subscriptions, following that we can open to being a biannual instead of an annual, and just have one issue that's contest and one issue that isn't. And by doing that, then I can have people like you guys who are on the advisory board publish stories in it, because the contest thing, I want it to be blind, and then out of all the stuff I read, I send it on to Molly Antipal is going to be the judge. The other thing is I've had again, you guys know I love genre fiction, and I love the stories that Saturday Evening Post used to publish in Liberty Magazine and Collier's and all that sort of stuff. So I wanted to return to those kinds of stories. So we're going to emphasize literary stories have their place and they can be in the magazine too. But I'm more interested in like Westerns and rom-coms and thrillers and horror and detective and all the stuff that counts as genre fiction, which is seen as less. I'm trying to bring up just like years ago, suddenly spec fic has got all this respect now, and you see it in lit journals all over the place. And I want to bring back some of these other genres like the Western and give it the respect it deserves and have it published in literary magazines. So genre mixed with, strong characters and language that rocks, but I want these stories to entertain. Benjamin Percy's idea of thrill me. That's what I'm looking for. So um, that's yeah, Jeremy, when he was able to get a hold of Grant, I know this has been a passion of yours, and you've been trying to, do this with North American Review, get some crime stories, and what do you think? And I'm like, dude, this is awesome. So that's the in miniature the story of short story right now, and that's the direction we're headed, and hopefully we can get subscriptions, enough interest that we can go to biannual, and I can have you guys in there because right now, obviously the advisory board, it would seem like a conflict of interest, but I think
Yeah, yeah,
once
no,
we don't
that's
do it
great.
as a contest, and I respect your guys' work a hell of a lot, and you guys fit the niche for me, like that different kind of experimental fiction, all that kind of stuff. The kind of stuff you do with history, Ted. So we're folk tales, fairy tales. We want to be open to all kinds of possibilities. We don't want to be limiting, but entertain is the key word here.
Right, right. Well, I want to get Brady in on this. You reminded me. This is not a verbatim quote, but I remember reading John. I've got like all of John Gardner's craft books behind me. He's a bit of a controversial figure, but his craft books, they give you things to think about. But I think he defined literary fiction as fiction that was too serious to be enjoyed. You know, uh, but the other thing, when Jeremy sent out that initial email a couple of weeks ago, inviting me to be on the advisory board and kind of explain what you guys are up to. Um, the first thought I had, besides, yeah, I'd love to, was, I've been teaching this MFA program at Lindenwood for almost a decade now. And for the last couple of years, the main thing I've been doing is advising students' thesis projects. And see, very rarely do I have really like dyed in the wool literary writers. Almost all of them who are doing prose, are doing fantasy or doing,
Yeah.
genre fiction and so forth and so on. And I just know from talking to other people and other, kind of programs, teaching programs, that really is more reflective of what's coming out of the all of these programs that are out there, much more so than literary fiction. So I think short story, as you guys have envisioned it, is going to be really representative of what's going on in fiction right now, for the most part, anyway. Was that kind of your sense as well, Grant?
Yeah, I think you're right on with that. I mean, I don't teach in an MFA program, and that's not to put down our program. It's an MA program, emphasis in creative writing, and I teach a lot of undergrads. In this semester, I'd say I had 16 students. Three of them did straight ahead. Well, now I'm starting to waffle a little. Three of them did literary fiction, but in that three grouping, they were still the speculative elements, right? But they were doing literary speculative fiction, two of them, but one was doing straight ahead, kind of queer based stories that were literary. So yeah, so let's say one in 16, three in 16 possibly, and then 13 of 16 we're doing, a lot of high fantasy, of course, and some murder mystery. I think the influence of the instructor, and some comic horror. They love horror. Horror is another thing that I get a lot of. So high fantasy and horror are kind of the two that I see a lot of. So yeah, you're right on about that, and I imagine that's what's coming out of workshops, or that's what a lot of these writers read in their spare time, if you will. Like I'm when I get talking about stuff, I try to use like a literary story example, and then students get talking and they're using all these examples from like SF and other um, genre-based sources, to talk about the work in front of them. So at least it's
Right.
not just movies. So I got to give them that.
Yeah. Brady, do you have any thoughts on this new project that you're advising?
Oh no, I'm delighted, and I like the way that Grant and Jeremy are thinking about this to make it open to genre fiction, to exciting stuff. Like of course, I love Melville, and
Yeah,
I'm
right.
teaching a course in the spring on Faulkner and Louise Erdrich. I like serious literary artists, call it that, but then I love reading, adventure stories, and I kind of write, uh, sort of something like adventure stories. But I have a question. Can I go back to Grant and to you too, Ted? So Ted and and Grant were texting the other day about the sort of collapse of readership in America. But readership for high fantasy, as Grant describes it, has remained strong. And I'm curious about why that genre in particular seems to uh, resonate so strongly with young readers uh, in the US. That's a huge question. Like, why is that genre thriving when almost all other kinds of readership seem to be abating, or certainly among young male readers?
Well,
Yeah,
I have a theory. Maybe Grant, you can think
you go with
first.
your theory first, Ted, and then I'll piggyback because I got a theory too, and it's just a theory. But I love.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, yeah, again, you're right, Brady. We could, devote a whole nother kind of podcast to just talking about this question. Um, because mainly it is females and particularly young females who are readers now. Males and once they hit the age of 13, don't tend to read much of anything. But I do think that the people who have been so influenced by video and by certain kinds of movies. I mean, the Avatar movies, the Star Wars series, and so forth, so on. So many young people are attracted to like Korean and Japanese, anime and that kind of thing. And I think of the readable genres available in the U.S. market, the high fantasy stuff is the most like those kinds of entertainments, and so that may be touching a entertainment nerve that Raymond Carver or whatever just doesn't come close to, or something. So I think there may be a correlation between what they're used to in terms of video games, movies, TikTok videos, etc., and their reading material. I don't know, Grant. What do
Yeah.
you think?
I'm going to talk more from a personal perspective because that's sometimes, as from all the acting I've done, I've learned sometimes the best way to look at something is to try to connect it to yourself and hope maybe it connects with other people because I don't know. But I know when I first started writing, I did not want to write about myself. And so I wrote stories about people that hung out in pool halls because I come from the working class, but I romanticized notions of the working class I didn't really experience, but I thought were cool. So I had characters riding motorcycles and, hanging out like I said, in pool halls and working bowling alleys and all this stuff. And at some point, I realized I needed to get closer to myself in my writing. And I started writing sort of quasi autobiographical stories about 12 to 14-year-olds because I felt at 25 I had enough distance from that I could I could write about it. But I think a lot of these you haven't lived much of a life. You're in your early 20s and you're taking a workshop and it's scary to put yourself out there on the line and share things that you've experienced unless you've experienced trauma or something dramatic. You feel like these little things that have happened to me aren't a good story. And so you can go into the world of high fantasy and start creating all kinds of stuff and deal with that and use your imagination and not feel like somehow you're missing the mark. Because I know all my early stories failed, and part of it was they weren't authentic, and at least that's what I was being told constantly in a workshop, and it was quite a a beating, a beat down, and so I think sometimes people turn to genre because there's tropes that you're familiar with and things you can do and all of that. So I'm not saying it's easier, but it's a way to displace the self into some other form and still use parts of yourself, but not have to worry about being totally accurate or getting it right in the way that when you're doing sort of a story about a guy that just got a cancer diagnosis, and what goes on in the rest of his day. Like, wow. I mean, that's a pretty heavy trip for a 21-year-old to try, who maybe has not had a cancer diagnosis, to write that kind of story. So anyway, that's just a small little example, like taken from myself. And then once I got married and knew more about sex and knew more about raising children, a confidence grew. And as with that confidence grew an ability to express myself in more meaningful ways than I had been before. So I think part of it is just a lot of these writers are young, and that's not anything to be ashamed of. It's just, it's hard to put yourself out there when you're only 21 years old.
Well, yeah, and I also think that for this is kind of a tricky topic to get into, but well, I'll just try to start with sort of a quasi factual statement. For a long time, it's kind of slowed down a little bit, but for a couple of years there, a lot of my young female writers were writing about young female characters who were witches or who had like secret powers. And obviously there's there's a bunch of stories in the main out there, published stories, award-winning stories, being made into movies, novels about, young witches, et cetera, et cetera. But it seemed to me like maybe, that psychologically, they did feel sort of powerless, and the idea of having a sort of secret power that the world couldn't see, but that they could use, to correct wrongs and so forth. I don't know. So to me, there was a kind of a psychological element there that
Yeah.
maybe they fantasized literally about having a sort of secret power, and so they created characters that had this secret power. And like I said, it slowed down a little bit. I haven't had any young witch protagonists for a little while, but there for a while, man, I swear to goodness, every time I opened up a story by a young female writer, it's like, okay, here we go. They're writing about a witch, I don't know.
And I think for me, I wrote a lot of stories about sadness and loneliness. I mean, that those themes still work their way into the Hayden Fuller stuff and in the Eddie Sands stories. It's, but I think at 20, 24 years old, I didn't know how to write about that stuff. I mean, I didn't have the maturity to write like a Patty Chayefsky Marty, I think, or a Paul Schrader Taxi Driver, if you will. I mean, Travis Bickle. I mean, I wanted to write those kinds of stories about alienation. But I didn't have my voice yet. It took a long time to figure out what that was, and I didn't have the distance. We talked about that, hot and cold. I didn't have the distance to understand myself, to really be able to put myself out there and explore those. Now, I've had some students who 19, 20 are incredible. Their feelings are they're so honest. They can get it on the page. I couldn't. My head was not where it needed to be able to do that, and I needed time to evolve. But I've had a lot of students that I don't know what it is, but they've got it. Their emotions are right there, and they can tap into them, and they're not all, I mean, acting really helped me to open up, is what I'm trying to say. I was very repressed in ways and couldn't get that out on the page. So, part of that's just living a life. Again,
Right.
I don't want to dismiss young writers, because I think Hemingway, some of his best stuff, most of his best stuff for me was written when he was under 30. That's just my
for
opinion,
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Brianna, do you have any thoughts on I don't know, the attraction of high fantasy nowadays? Or I know you have a daughter who writes. I don't know what she's interested in terms of her own reading and writing. Foci.
I'm sorry, Ted, were you asking me or asking Grant?
Yeah, you, Brady. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, no. So yes, yeah, interesting. You should ask about my daughter. She's interested in speculative fiction and dystopian and utopian kinds of fictions. I mean, she reads very broadly. She's she'll tear through a whole series of Le Guin books and then Ferrante books. Right? She's very diverse and eclectic. But part of what I am wondering about the high fantasy is it seems like an interesting oblique way to get at how dismal life seems and how we're not like nobody really seems no one governments and businesses don't seem committed to saving the environment. And so there's high fantasy on the one hand would seem to be a retreat from what is becoming an increasingly dismal and violent or continuously violent world. On the other hand, I mean, if I'm not an expert reader in fantasy at all, but it seems like, from my understanding, very loose understanding, Tolkien, there's some ways in which we can understand Lord of the Rings as in relationship to World War II and to the
Mm-hmm.
gathering of armies and the Nazis and the darkness of the Axis powers. I'm interested in why of the fantasy. So then to bring it back to my daughter, who is someone who is very keenly invested in defense of the environment, defense of water, and uh, I think so many young people, whereas older generations either don't get it, don't care, just worry about how much does it cost for a gallon of gas and a gallon of milk. Otherwise, to hell with it. Young people I think are passionate about trying to have a life and have a future. Yeah, maybe that comes out in certain kinds of speculative fiction, certain kinds of science fiction. Certainly, as I've just said, the utopian kinds of stories, but also in particular the darkness of dystopian stories, which there are certainly um, no shortage of to be read these days.
Yeah, all very interesting. So like I said, after the holidays, we'll schedule some time and get Jeremy in here, and the four of us will talk just mainly about short story and where you guys are headed with it, and all that stuff. So I think that's very cool. Yeah, another friend of mine on Facebook announced that her college is starting a new literary journal. So there's no shortage of journals out there. It's just kind of a shortage of people reading them, unfortunately. But maybe that will turn around too eventually. So we'll just have to kind of see what happens here. So one really nuts and bolts question, Brady. Do you have a number of stories in mind? We've been talking about this collection that you're working on. Do you have I'm going to write 12, or as I've mentioned before, when I started on my sonnets to Mary Shelley about a year ago, I thought, I'll write 5 of them and get kind of scratch that itch, and I'll get back to a novel project. And then I was enjoying them so much, I thought, I'll keep writing. And then suddenly I had 20 or 30, and it's like, I got kind of a chapbook length. And then I thought, I'm still enjoying the heck out of writing this. So anyway, at some point I realized I just will go ahead and write a whole collection. I ended up with 103 of them, and 100 are in the actual final version here. So do you have a number? Is it closer to 5 or closer to 100?
Oh, well, so yeah, that actually I've thought a great deal about this, Ted. And I mean, I am worried about the legal department's gonna shut us down. But uh, what I'm thinking, I want a skinny book. I want, and as part of the respect and honoring Hemingway, although I have lots of reservations about, him as a human being. I have lots of reservations about myself as a human being. Lots of reservations about lots of different folks. We've had this conversation about the problematic nature of writers we admire. We admire their work, but we wouldn't let them in our house and we wouldn't let them near our children. But Hemingway's books, one of the great things about Hemingway's, those short story collections, is they hit so hard, I think, because they're so compressed, right? And they're short. And so part of what has also, this book is an homage in its way, but it's an homage to the writers, a lot of the writers that I've always really loved and admired. And so some of the stories are only 1 page long. So it's not really a matter of how many, it's the end result is going to come out at around 120 pages. And
Okay.
and I want a kind of gestalt, my own reaction. What do I think about when I think about Hemingway? What stories matter to me? Why did they matter? What kinds of things about him and his ethos that I might have, when I was young, found attractive, but now I have no patience for? I want to address those things, but I want to keep it tight. I want to do honor in that way and be respectful in that way as well. So who knows? But yeah, like, and the 1 pagers are almost all very often in the spirit of Spoon River Anthology. So this is also my Illinois book. So
Ah,
the other one was my France book. Um, the story collection is, kind of somewhat Western, but my Midwestern days are coming out, or at least my Midwestern
It,
homage.
it's interesting you mentioned Spoon River because that's what Sanford Meisner, he took stuff out of there and had his actors work on it. Those were part of his acting exercises, would be famous works that were in Spoon River, and you'd have to bring them to life as an actor. So that's really cool. And I think what would be interesting, Brady, I'm not Ted, I'm not the publisher of 12 Winters Press, but uh, it might be cool to an accompanying chapbook down the road or some, secret key that we can go somewhere. And I would love to hear all of the meta stuff that goes behind the stories. I don't want it in the same, I want that slender volume and let the
Yeah.
stories just stand for themselves, the work stand for itself. But I wouldn't mind getting a decoder ring, and just hear your ramblings, your, as you would say, natterings about, which are always fascinating to me, by the way. I don't think you natter at all, but I think that would be awesomeness. Kind of like with 12 Winters, where there's like the reflection by the author at the end of the story, but a separate document somewhere, that we have to find like buried treasure and enjoy your ruminations and stuff on the work. That would be super cool. Because I've enjoyed, like, with Our Mile, when I get talking and you start telling me things about, I'm like, oh my God, okay, now I see this. I didn't get that, and it's really cool to kind of get a window into some of the choices. Like I got the Sean Flynn thing, but I totally was missing the boat with Lawrence, because then we got talking on text, and then you told me, and I was like, oh, a light bulb went off. So, it'd be cool. It'd be awesome, man. And anyway, just some thoughts on that.
yeah, no, I agree. That would be great to get that somehow or another. So we'll have to work on that. So, well, by the old clock on the wall, we probably ought to shift gears just a bit and turn to our featured story, which is from the autumn 2025 edition of the Shanghai Literary Review. And I discovered this journal because I submitted something to them and they didn't take it, but but I did get a copy of the journal that I purchased. And so when it arrived, I was really interested in it. And it's actually a very cool journal. I've been reading the heck out of it. Interestingly, there's only one short story in this fairly large journal. It's mostly poetry and nonfiction and two or three really interesting interviews and artwork. But we're going to be talking about a story called The Fog. And boy, I'm going to struggle with this writer's last name, so I apologize to her in advance. But Roseanne Pereira, perhaps
Maybe
Pereira, yeah.
I was thinking Pereira, maybe.
Pereira, yeah, that sounds good.
I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. So sorry, Roseanne, you deserve better. But I'm going to read the first couple of paragraphs, as I tend to do, because they're kind of short paragraphs, and give just a brief synopsis. I think we had somewhat different reactions to this story, and so that'll be interesting to get some of our different perspectives on this piece. But again, this is The Fog from the Shanghai Literary Review, just published within the last couple of months. And it begins. From my window seat, I looked down at the baggage handler loading my father's coffin. Of all the ways that Dad and I had envisioned visiting his village together, this had not been one of them. My mother and I were heading from America halfway across the world to bury him in the Goan village where he was born, a place I had last visited when only an infant, and of which I had no direct memory. When you die, my mother said from the aisle seat, her W's transformed to harsher sounding V's like always. Without our asking, a few young Indian men had helped us stow our luggage in the overhead compartments. I assumed it had something to do with my mother's auntie vibe, or maybe somehow they knew. All right. And so we have this short story. And again, the basic plot is the narrator's father has died. We find out pretty quickly that he drowned, saving a young woman who was, drowning, and he was able to save her, but the undertow got him, and so he drowned. And so they're taking his body to India, where he grew up. And he and his wife immigrated to the U.S. They had their daughter Tara, I believe, something like that. And but now he's died, as I say, and so they're taking his body back to his home village, a place that the daughter only knows from family stories and from photographs. And so it's a pretty linear story. They're on the flight, then they're in India, then they go to their village, and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, at the same time, the daughter, thinks back to her childhood and experiences she had with her dad and her mom. She was always much closer to her father. Her mother was always a little colder and more distant, and so that obviously is making this trip all the harder because of their lack of connection in their own relationship. And there's this kind of reoccurring motif of water and the beach. As I say, the father drowned, but then significant, action ends up taking place on a beach and in the water in India. And then there's the snow globe with the beach scene that gets referred to, time and again. So anyway, there's some really interesting, I think, some motifs at work in the story, and a really interesting, I think, twist at the end that I wasn't expecting, which I found very pleasing because I didn't see it coming. But anyway, let me stop there. And I know, Grant, you were particularly enthusiastic about The Fog. So let me go to you first of all. And why exactly did you connect with this story so closely?
Well, I don't want to dominate things here, but absolutely adored this story. I saw the plot as circular, not necessarily linear. Yes, it's linear in terms of time progression, but there's always a sense of returning in the story. And there is so much doubling in this piece. Like it's something I've been looking at in mystery writing, is all the ways, like in the Perry Mason novels, how many times there's two guns, there's two women, there's this, there's that. He does doubling constantly, in Earl Stanley Gardner does. Just reread Case Pending by Del Shannon, another really good mystery writer. And in her books, I got like 20 types of doublings. Charles Baxter talks about this and calls it rhyming action, in which, and I wrote this down because I wanted to make sure I remembered it. Image, language, or sound gets repeated later, and it has a little bit of different resonance. So just some things that I noticed that were The Fog, beginning of the story, end of the story, we return to it, and it's kind of a state of being. The parents fight at the end of the story. At the beginning of the story, we have a parents fight. She runs down to the beach. Near the end, we find out it was one of the last conversations they had, and it was a big argument, and there was a big fight. The parents, La La Land gets mentioned early on, and then later at the end, near the end, Act 3, let's say, mom is having a conversation with the decedent, and she goes to La La Land when she had been mocking her daughter. There's a thing about American expressions, and she kind of ridicules the daughter and the father for using, and then later she uses them, and we something about a dark room, a black room, and then also a silver lining notion. There's a Lot reference early, and we come back to Lot later. There's shells, and that's the rhyme that's really close together, where she remembers being a kid and the shells washing up, and then later, as she's back in the old country, the homeland, shells coming. The coffin, this big fancy coffin that gets put on a plane, and later it won't fit in the cemetery, so they have to, get a wood coffin. And then she doesn't just do this doubling rhymes, she has triplets like in music. So dad's ring, the first time we see it, it's in a bag, and mom's gonna, boil it down or whatever you do, heat it down, melt it down, for the gold. And the daughter's appalled. And then later she's wearing it around her neck. And then at the end of the story, as she goes out alone and has sort of her epiphanic moment, the ring isn't on her. So there's some that signifies something. So the ring goes through three different progressions. The bells. The bells. We get a flashback early on in which she worked the bells at the school she went to. Then when they go to the father's homeland, bells are ringing. That means somebody died. And then at the end of the story, we hear bells again, and she wonders what the significance is. Again, this sort of open-ended ending where what is her future going to be? And then finally, the hook nose, which becomes a thing where she's ridiculed because no one can figure out her ethnicity, and the boys at school make comments about it. And then she assumes that the dad rescued this girl because she had a hook nose and looks a lot like her. And then we find out near the end of the story, the third time this is referenced, so the triplet effect, that actually the girl looks like pictures of her mom as a youngster. So it goes through three different iterations: her being teased for appearance, her assuming dad was rescuing her, and then at the end, oh, maybe dad was rescuing mom. So like just this, so there's a very circular pattern, and coming back to the beginning of things. And I think there's something about that when you go to another country or I've never done this. I've always wanted to go to Macedonia, but I have a feeling when I go there, there'll be this feeling of doubleness of being in two places at once. And I felt the story really captured that kind of vibe of a stranger in a land that your blood comes from, and piecing it all together. So it really worked for me. It spoke to me. That's what I got.
Yeah, that's great. No, that's a great analysis.
Right. I
Brady,
read it 3 times. So I was so moved by it. So
there you
anyway.
go. Oh, that's great. Brady, let me kick it over to you. What were your thoughts on The Fog?
Well, I am persuaded to rethink it by Grant's analysis for sure. And I mean, all of what Grant is saying, is fascinating, and the kind of pattern. What I liked in particular about this story, though I'm not as keen on it as Grant is that there's a kind of dreaminess to this story. People appear, and then the narrator, what is happening? They're gone, or they weren't there. Like it has a kind of dream logic where things and people appear, but then they disappear, and she doesn't really notice, and so it has a uh, on the one hand, this tight kind of patterning a pattern that Grant describes, but then there's a kind of looseness, a kind of uncertainty that is woven through the story, and I enjoyed that element. That left me wondering what's going on, what kind of world am I inhabiting, and that made the story attractive for me.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, yeah, and one of the reoccurring motifs that Grant didn't mention in his very thorough analysis, which I wholly appreciate, is again, the story starts off with them in the airplane, and she's looking down at the black ocean between, underneath them. But there's this reoccurring thing of her like being above or seeming to be above and looking down, or wanting to be above and looking down on whatever view that would be, because she feels like she'd have a better sense of it, maybe more control over it if she were above it. And then again at the end, she's in the water, and then she's looking down into the water. So there's this reoccurring motif of either being above and looking down on life, or wanting to be above and looking down on life. So yeah, there's just a lot of reoccurring reoccurring patterns in this story. And quite honestly, I didn't think of things in quite that way until, Grant's expert analysis of it. Another thing I was attracted to in terms of this story, and one of the reasons I wanted to share it with you guys, get your thoughts on it, was because of the fact we had talked about third person versus first person point of view so much in the last episode. And obviously, this is a first person narrator. And I think this writer handles point of view, very expertly. And this kind of goes to what Brady had been saying, I think, in part at least, that because she ends up in a country where she doesn't speak the language, but yet she keeps encountering all these people, and she has to sort of presume, project a little bit what they may be thinking, what they may be wanting, particularly the old woman that she meets at the end of the story or toward the end of the story. She thinks she knows what's going on between her and the old woman, but she doesn't know for sure. And so I think that's maybe part of that dreaminess too, that Brady talks about. And I think it works well because of the first person narrator. I think if this were a third person narrator, the third person narrator could just tell us, oh, the old woman, was thinking X, Y, and Z. She couldn't communicate it in English, et cetera, et cetera. But the narrator doesn't know for sure. Therefore, we don't know for sure, And again, I think that creates an interesting sort of, it contributes to the mysterious, kind of ambiance that is oftentimes part of this narrative. Brady, you're kind of nodding. Do you think Grant too? Do you think, both of you guys, do you think POV contributes to that sort of fogginess, dreaminess? Grant?
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I'm not really disagreeing with you. I know you know this because you're quite an accomplished writer, but obviously you could, in limited third, be writing so close to the character that she could just be almost as closely unaware of what all this stuff means as in first person. So I mean, you wouldn't necessarily be able to decode everything if you're walking right like this instead of here or here with respect to the character. But yeah, there is a kind of fogginess. I mean, I hadn't thought about that. You guys, I think, nailed it. An uncertainty and a kind of fogginess to the experience because culturally she's not enmeshed in that culture and she's kind of finding her way around within that world. So yeah, I think the first person really works to give us that instability, uncertainty, as you guys have been saying. That Excellent. Yeah. I mean, that's why I love doing this stuff because I learned something. I hadn't thought about that at all. Yeah, that's
absolutely
awesome.
Brady, thoughts on that, to POVs?
Yeah, no, I agree. And yeah, it's really interesting. The scene with the older woman towards the end, there are other older women there. And I won't, give away, but there's something sort of in the realm of magic from our narrator's point of view, but it's sort of hallucinatory. Like the narrator, does the narrator fall asleep? Where do they go? And so I think you're exactly right, Ted, that it depends very in very important ways on the problem of the first person point of view and their perception and their ability to make sense of what may or may not actually be going on in the world, or maybe the world is not our world and incredible things can happen anyway. But I like that sense of dislocation, but it is dependent upon the sort of unreliability or the uncertainty that we experience when when the narrator perceives and then doesn't perceive what seems to be going on around them, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think oftentimes the writing is just very, lovely, for lack of a better word. For example, I loved this description on page 121 for you guys. This is when they've made it to the village and their home, or the parents' home at least, and all the different relatives and neighbors are offering their condolences and so forth. And this is the second full paragraph. And heartfelt sympathies, each one said in careful English. My mind could not piece together what was happening except in bits. The wind whipping against my skin, my hair flapping against my face. I could feel my mother's eyes on my hair, staring it down as if trying to control it with her mind. I think that's just a lovely little bit, that especially the idea of her mother feeling her mother trying to will her hair. And was her mother really doing that, or is that just the narrator's perception of what was happening because of the difficult relationship that she has with her mom throughout? And there are 2 or 3 places like that where I marked that I just really love the writing. And again, it's not Baroque. It's not, doesn't go off in all kinds. It's not a 1,000-word descriptive paragraph, but I think it very neatly and perceptively, communicates so much about the narrator and the mom and that kind of thing. I don't know. What about the writing style? Did either of you have any thoughts regarding just this writer's ability, putting words together and creating images, etc.? Did anything stand out to you in particular? I know I'm really putting you on the spot, Brady.
No, it's effortless. The prose does not push us around. The story, my only contribution to the conversation is that the story sort of, or the consciousness comes in and out of focus, but the language keeps it moving along. And so sometimes they do have that far away, very high looking down at, but the prose still keeps effortlessly going along. So yeah, it wasn't hard to read at all.
Right. Well, right. We had a story a couple of episodes ago that or more, maybe it was 3 or 4, but that we all kind of loved. Well, not kind of, we did love it, but yeah, we couldn't really say what the heck it was about. It was like really interesting. And that, by the way, that writer now follows me on Instagram. So apparently she was not insulted by our not quite knowing what her story was about, even though we loved it. And it was an award-winning story, by the way. I mean, it wasn't just us. But I don't know, Grant, do you have any thoughts on the style per se?
Yeah, I'm just coming back. Like my idea for how to read the story didn't come out of just nowhere. I mean, it's there in the language. I mean, she writes in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th paragraph, looking out the window when there is fog. They don't land. They just circle and circle, she said. She even repeats the word circle, which is like, for me, the narrative is like circling. She uses the word 2 or 3 times in the piece, swirling, swirling around in my mind, I think at one point. So yeah, I just, to me, that's here's she let the waters lap at her gnarled toes and swirl around her ankles. So I think the language itself allows for some of that feeling of circling, and the repetitions, etc. So I thought that was really cool, and I liked what you said, Ted. It reminds me of couple episodes ago, maybe it was last episode, you said something like, if I say cat, you're going to see a cat. I don't need to go on for I might see a Persian cat, or I might see a calico cat, but I'm going to see a cat, right? I mean, I don't need like 3 pages of description of the cat, and I feel like she has economical descriptions, but they bring alive, the world building, the mise en scène, as the French film critics would say, of the world she's inhabiting. So I think she does a really judicious job with that, mixing scenic detail with sort of this uncertainty kind of insights, and trying to collect information, knowledge to understand what's going on around her, and making observations. I think it's pretty cool.
Right.
I think here in episode 30, Ted, if I may, I think this is the time where we have to turn on one another. And so I want a 3-page description of the cat. And I'm going to give you one too. So that, So we're just going to have to disagree.
That's all right, brother. I can respect that. I mean, hey man, Dickens did it, but he was getting paid by the word. You know what I'm saying? I mean,
Dickens, yeah. Sorry, Ted, I cut you off because
Yeah.
I wanted to throw down Grant, like, that's it, bud. We're done, man. I'm getting angry here. Yeah.
Show
Well,
me your wrist,
actually,
baby. Let's go. So,
and
yeah.
I know you're being, sort of funny, but I actually did have this thought. I go back and listen to our old episodes or the recent ones and the old ones, and I realized I came off on kind of a description shrew or something. I made it sound like I was like anti-description, and I'm not. I love a good, raucous description. I mean, my gosh, I love the master, and he
Oh,
does
dude.
the Baroque prose of William
Bong, bong.
Gass. But so it isn't that I'm opposed to it. I think I guess what I was trying to make the point is I think younger writers have to develop a sense of proportion and have to more importantly perhaps develop a sense of timing. I guess what I was
Yes.
objecting to were just getting a narrative underway and then giving us this lengthy, unnecessary, and not particularly artistic, description, just more like a police report kind of description as opposed to something that's really trying to be, cut above in terms of the use of language and that kind of thing. So I'm not anti-description. It's just, I think that we don't have to assume that as soon as we introduce a character or a place that we have to provide a, 250 word paragraph describing it in such a way that they can see it. They don't necessarily have to see it. And actually, I was thinking about that point with this story, and I'm not going to be able to track it down, but we go quite a while before we really get very detailed descriptions of the central characters. So we have quite a bit happening in the first few pages of the story, with knowing just the bare basics in terms of who these characters are and what sort of their ethnicity may be, and therefore that gives us kind of a general sense of probably what they look like, compared to if they were returning the body to Rwanda or to Copenhagen or something like that. We get a sense of all that. Hey, before I forget, let me give the writer's bio. Maybe you guys can think if there is another point or two you'd like to make regarding this. So I'm going to go to the author's website as well, because this actually has quite a bit more info than we get here. This is the contributor's note in the back of the Shanghai Literary Review. And Roseanne Pereira's work has appeared in a variety of print, online, and broadcasting outlets, including Catapult, Minnesota Public Radio, and Sierra. She served as a Kroc Fellow, that's KROC, a Kroc Fellow at NPR, and an Upper Midwest Human Rights Fellow at the Center for Victims of Torture. She has also been a two-time fellow at the Writers by Writers Tamales Bay Workshop, a writer in residence at Hedgebrook, and a Tin House Scholar. In 2023, she was awarded the Levi's Prize from Friends of Writers, which provides funds for debut manuscript completion to one fiction writer and one poet each year. And she has a website, Roseanne Pereira, again, that's PEREIRA.com. And again, if you go there, she has a really cool quote from Zora Neale Hurston at the head of her website, and it's from Their Eyes Were Watching God, of course. And the quote is, "There are years that ask questions and years that answer." Interesting. And then it says, Roseanne's writing, I'm not saying her last name, explores the intersections of spirituality, history, and food. I think we can see that in this story. Her fiction investigates ancestral connections and cultural hauntings. And then let me go elsewhere here if I can. Oh, there it is. She goes on to say, the daughter of immigrants from GOA. Roseanne grew up in sunny South Florida. A warm presence continues to imbue her work. Then it gives a lot of the same info that I just read in that contributor's notes. She has representation through Trellis Literary Management. No book listings to her credits just yet, so I suspect she has a manuscript with that agent that represents her. But she's published quite a bit, both fiction and nonfiction. She has another piece that came out in in Catapult called Searching La La Land. So obviously has some interconnections with this story. Another story in Shanghai Literary Review, issue 7. This is issue 9, Cats, and then a very long list of nonfiction and journalism credits as well. She also will help other writers with their manuscripts and that kind of thing. She has an email newsletter you can sign up for about engaging writing craft issues in her newsletter. So a lot of stuff happening. Seems like a very vibrant writer with a lot of really cool stuff going on. But again, I think we can see a lot of that bio and her interests represented in this story. I don't know, do you guys have any, maybe it's a good time for some final thoughts. If you have any final thoughts either about this story and or about anything else we talked about this episode, let me kick it over to you, Grant, since you began in such an expert fashion our discussion of this story. Do you have final thoughts either about the story itself or just about anything else?
Well, I just have one on writing, and I just wonder how much, coming back to my idea of the circle, there's sort of a perpetual feedback system like there is with Hollywood. You find out what films are popular and you keep making those kind of films. And I just wonder how much my aesthetic, because, Brady's praised my work, and thank you, Brady, for like being really compressed and like moving quickly, like all the Eddie Sand stories. But that's also because a lot of those places I send to don't want more than 3,000 words or 4,000 words. So it's almost like my aesthetic is programmed in a way by the market demand, and yet it's also an aesthetic I believe in. But do I believe in the aesthetic because that's the market demand, or is that just how Grant rolls because he likes crime fiction? And I think it's how Grant rolls, if I'm totally honest with myself. Like, I can't stand reading a 3-page, you said police report earlier, Ted. I don't need an interrogation scene with question and answer. Can we just summarize the goddamn thing and maybe pick a couple of things that are important to share with the readers? I don't need, Ed McBain will do that in his 87th Precinct novels, and he's a really, really good writer. But I'm like, Ed, baby, come on. This is like, I can do this in half a page, read some Cheever, baby. So anyway, that's my feeling on description, but I realize it's maybe caught up in my aesthetics, and the market demands get intermingled and it gets confusing. So I just wanted to put that out there for other writers. That's my feel on that.
Cool. Yeah. Brady, thoughts?
Well, we've been ragging on Fuzzy Dice. I think in some episodes we don't need to know about the fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror. I do need to know. I'm playing. No, so I do. By way of concluding remarks, I was thinking about this and watching and listening in a kind of awe, and have been reminded. Maybe Whitman and others said this. Well, I'll just say Whitman. I can't remember, but what good writers need are good readers, and Grant modeled for us in this episode really great reading and really taking the story and the writer's work seriously, giving it time, letting it process in the mind. And so out there in the world, out there in America, where there's this falling off the cliff of readership, writers need good readers. And so it's I would say, a call to arms. Not only are we interested in our podcast in writing and sharing writing advice and talking about publication and stories and journals and books and all that kind of stuff, but we're also, at the end of each of our podcasts, we reverse and we become, hopefully, good readers. And so, the world needs more good readers. America needs. Get smart, America.
Well, yeah, I've mentioned on several occasions that I really do believe that we are living in a golden age of creative writing. I mean, I believe that there's more great writing being written and published now than at any other time in human history, but it just happens to correspond to a time period when there are fewer and fewer people reading that great writing. And the other thing, I don't want to, your final thoughts were so good, I should have just ended with that, Brady. But as you guys know, I've been doing some international traveling in recent years. I was in Singapore, Vietnam, Morocco, et cetera, et cetera. And it really drives home the fact that English language authors are not just sort of trying to get space in journals with U.S. and English authors, but English is spoken and written all over the world, and really, really well. I mean, here we have a English language journal based in Shanghai, China. And again, I think it's just emblematic of the fact that we have great writing in English being done all over the world as well. And so, I mean, it's just a sort of awe-inspiring, maybe, when you think of it in those terms as well. So, all right, guys. Well, I appreciate you giving up some time on a Thursday evening. And, have a great holiday. Get some rest from grading papers for a couple of weeks. And we'll figure out some time in January to get together. And like I said, we'll also plan a bonus episode to talk more in more depth about the new short story journal that Grant and Jeremy Schraffenberger have brought back to life. So thanks a lot, guys. And thanks, readers and listeners. And thank our author, Roseanne, for a really interesting story. And I should have been prepared to hit the stop record button.